I'll give you another minute and a half or so to make a guess. Roseanne, very good guess. Very informed guess, Cecil also. Okay, you another 15 seconds for your guess. Yep, yeah, people have got it. So actually what a lot of people have kind of guessed it, which is that, you know, the commonality between these things are, have actually ties to both human trafficking and drug trafficking. And that is really how Boston has gotten its wealth, right? Through human trafficking, right? Through the Atlantic slave trade, and as well as drug trafficking through opium in China. And so all of these things that you see here are actually funded directly with opium money, especially. And the people there should look a little familiar because they're really on all the buildings around Boston when you're walking around. And all those people were drug smugglers, I like to call them. Yeah, we'll kind of dig deep into that a little bit more. Go, can I actually ask you to share screen because I'm having a hard time finding the speaker. Is this okay?
Sure. Give me a second.
So I'll just introduce myself, and Go will introduce himself first. I'm Katie again. I'm currently the Boston Public Schools Ethnic Studies Coordinator and Coach, and that was a position that was won and fought for by teachers in the Boston Teachers Union. And this is Go. I'll do a quick intro of him while he's kind of getting that screen up.
I need co-host permission for screen sharing to be opened.
Can you do that? Is that okay, Molly? Great, you got it. So Go, do you want to introduce yourself really quick? You want me to?
Yes, can you introduce me, please?
Sure. So Go is a teacher in Boston Public Schools. He works at the O'Brien Math and Science School, and he is currently teaching biology, but full disclosure, he and I live in the same house. We are partners, so that people know that. Okay, great, thanks, Go. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so really what we're trying to do is first setting the stage for you. How did this come to be that so many buildings, so many things in Boston have connection with opium, right? But before that, you actually have to go back into even history and understand what the stage was at the beginning of quote unquote this country's founding, right? So when it became a quote unquote new country, what was the positionality of the United States versus China? So we'll do a quick clip of this. It's about a 5-minute clip. And this is from a documentary called Ancestors in the Americas, which I would highly recommend, which is also available on Canopy for free if you have a Boston Public, or a library card, actually, any library card. So we're just gonna watch this clip just to set the stage a little bit for us.
Let me know if the audio comes through okay. This computer sometimes is weird with video sharing audio.
It's not coming
through. Okay.
Okay, hold on. I'll do it. It's fine.
I'm gonna have to share.
Wait, yeah, I'll do it, and then we'll do a switch of. It's fine. Gotta love. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Into share sound. Okay. And here we go.
What we have in the 16th century is a China and an India with incredibly well-developed economies. And they are making items for export that go around the world. They're making porcelains, they're making wooden furnitures, they're making intricately embroidered fabrics, all sorts of things for the world market.
This is the study storage for Chinese export porcelain.
So, this is a place where they keep the goods our craftsmen made.
The plate that you're looking at here is made for the Dutch market. You can see all the Dutch galleons with those flags. And the galleons, of course, are in Cape Town, South Africa, which was a sort of major watering spot for the east-west trade coming from the Atlantic to China or returning. And the one next to it, made for the Italian market, with the family's arms in the center, all supported by a sauvage.
How exotic. And on a family's royal plate. And the Americans wanted eagles and shields, something to mark their pride in their new republic. Imagine the household of American President Thomas Jefferson dining on Chinese dinner plates made in South China, marked with his initial J. George Washington. A Chinese craftsman has expertly copied his likeness in life, and then again, following his death, copied and borne to the heavens by angels. He does not know exactly who George Washington is, but our officials knew. We took note of George Washington because he defeated the mighty British and made a new country, yet did not make himself emperor, something not common in history.
Wealth is thought to be developed really through trade at this time, not through industrialization. This is before the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So it's the merchants who think that they're going to be able to build up the wealth of this country. At this early time, we have Asia being wealthy, the United States being terribly poor, a very weak nation. So that the China trade was absolutely key in the very early years of this new nation in helping to build up some of its strength.
This is a very rare mezzotint of Haokua, Wuping Chen. It was unusual, of course, for a living Chinese to have his portrait painted in oil. So this was clearly a gesture towards Benjamin Chu Wilcox, with whom he did a great deal of business. He was considered to be the world's wealthiest merchant. His teas were known around the world.
Haokua befriended American traders who had come to Canton. Among them was John Murray Forbes, who acted as Haokua's scribe, and Haokua treated him like his son. In 1836, after a few years in Canton, Forbes was ready to go back home. Haokua gave him $500,000 in Mexican silver and asked him to invest that money in the US. Forbes asked him, "What shall I invest this money in?" Haokua said, "My son, why not the railroads?" Most people know Chinese labor was involved in the building of America's first transcontinental railroad. It was not Chinese labor, but Chinese capital, hard cash, that was used in the building of railroads in America's great Midwest, in Iowa, Michigan, Nebraska, Illinois. The advice came from a very astute Chinese merchant who, of course, never left Canton, never saw a railway track or a train.
After Haokua died, the Forbes family continued to send dividends to his descendants because this was a time when Chinese and American merchants could still be partners.
So from the audience, real quick,
What we have
Sorry.
in the
What's something you didn't know? Something that was surprising to you. The first time I watched this documentary, I was a little bit floored. I had never learned any of this, but I'm curious about anything that feels very new to you.
I would say, should we use the chat or should we use our voices?
Yeah, use your voices. Yeah.
Oh, right. I would say I'm actually kind of surprised, honestly, that Chinese merchants were treated as equals at any point and trading partners with Europeans. I guess the way I learned the story is that it was solely sort of conquest and trickery. Not that that's not part of the story, certainly, but that surprised me.
Yeah, I didn't know that Chinese capital was invested in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hokwa, this guy, was one of the richest people on in the world. You know, the China trade and the Indian trade actually was very, very, very strong at this time.
And that's one reason for the Crusades, because the Europeans wanted to cut the route from China, which was going through Arabia, the Fertile Crescent, to Europe. It wasn't about God and Christianity. They said, we have to take this trade directly ourselves. We don't want the middle people, middlemen, which was the Arab merchants who would bring it from the Chinese and take it to Europe and take goods back or money or whatever. So, but I didn't know about these buildings. That is shocking. I thought it was from slavery.
It's linked. We'll talk a little bit about how it's linked. Yeah. Why do you think most people don't know this history? I should say don't know this history. What is this a different narrative about?
I think most people think Western civilization is the center of the world.
Mm-hmm. So this idea of US dominance, right? That it was always and will always be, right? Is sort of a main narrative, especially in the United States, right? We're taught that, like, oh, you know, it's the UK and Spanish, that they were the ones who like had control over everything. And in fact, you know, in this period of time, it's not the case, right? US is like a fledgling country of that, right? It's really poor, and it's trying to get its feet wet, essentially. And they think that the best way to do that, you know, when they first became a country, one of the first things they did within a year was to send a ship to China to start trading with them as a new country, right? In order to build wealth, right? That was the idea at that point. So yeah, it flips the narrative, right, into a narrative that we're not familiar with. So really the question is, I think Cecil, this gets into your question, is like, well, I've heard of like this conquest and, you know, I've heard of this before, right? So what happens, right? So obviously there's this position where China has the upper hand, right? And so what happens now? What do Britain and the United States decide to do in order to shift that power, right? So we're going to look at this clip. It's about a 5-minute clip, and take note.
Tea had become, by the middle of the 18th century, a national drink in England, not only among the upper classes.
Did it work? What happened?
About 10% of household income was spent on buying teas.
And Americans also wanted tea. At your Boston Tea Party, a cargo dumped overboard into Boston Harbor to protest British control was tea from China. Who would guess that a war could come from the drinking of tea?
Of course, this tea had to be paid for, not in commodities, but in hard cash, in bullion, in Mexican silver dollar.
Instead of paying, Europeans just wanted to exchange their goods with China, but there was little that China required or wanted.
It created a serious trade balance problem for Britain and other trading companies from Europe.
We're talking about millions of pounds of tea, drunk by virtually every man, woman, and child in England and the colonies. The tea cost millions in British pounds and even more in American dollars. The British desperately needed something they could trade. They found it in opium.
We talk about the drug problem today in America and the rest of the world. The drug problem in China in the early 19th century was phenomenal. Most people think that the Chinese were in the habit of smoking opium through the centuries. The fact is, opium was introduced to China by the British from India, where it was grown under British control, and then smuggled into China. Americans were only second to the British in terms of pushing opium to China. Great family fortunes were made from opium trade. They read like who's who in America. The Cushings, the Cabot family, Delano, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Perkins, as in the Perkins Hall at Harvard.
So here's a question. Why did Britain decide to smuggle opium into China? And why did the US follow them? For what purpose?
To weaken the Chinese, obviously, to weaken them.
Mm-hmm. For what purpose?
So they could take advantage of them, trade-wise.
Mm-hmm. To do what? I mean, it's to take advantage of them.
To rule them.
Mm-hmm.
The British wanted to rule that area, and under Victoria and Albert, the whole theory was developed that Britain would have to control those countries. First, they said with trade and with companies like the tea company, but it really was going to eventually go to full control. They wanted full colonial control.
And colonial control for money, right? It was to profit, right? So when we're talking about colonialism, there is this component of money, profit, right? All means necessary, by all means necessary, right? It doesn't matter how we get it, we want wealth, right? And so as we're moving forward, just real quick, because these are slides built for students, right? And so you can literally download them and like modify them to what you need. But I'm sure like a lot of students, or some of us may be like, well, what is opium? What is that, right? And so does anyone know, like, can anyone think of words that like relate to the word opium that they know, that they hear now in the news? And
It's a highly addictive drug that more powerful and it's not the same as heroin, but it's very addictive, and that's all I know.
Mm-hmm. Other folks know what opium is, have heard of it before, or heard of its derivatives? You know, the opiate crisis, right? We've heard of the opiate crisis. That's all related, actually. All of that is related. So opium actually comes, it's a poppy flower. It's the poppy flower, right? And so what they do to process it is like there's this sap, this milk that comes out, right? And they process that. And back in the day, they would process that into balls, sticks, you know, like blocks, and then they would sell that, you know, smoke it, right? And actually, Robert, what you mentioned, opium is a highly addictive drug. It's actually related. It is heroin, morphine, and codeine are all opiates and opioids. They're all forms of natural and synthetic opium. So like people are talking now about like you know, I was talking to someone, they were like, opium, is that, you mean like opiates? And I was like, yes, exactly. Like the ones that we're like exactly what we're talking about right now, right? It's all related. So if you look back into opium history, it's like fascinating to see how in some ways, it came around to sort of bite this country back, right? Like in terms of the problems that are happening now in a contemporary way. So again, right, this opiate has an opiating effect, which essentially it makes people sleepy. It makes people very like lethargic, right? It kind of calms people's nerves. There's a time in the United States where you could say that people were using opium or its derivatives to treat anything, like babies even, right? So there was there's a long history of sort of opium and how it's introduced in opium addiction. It all stems from this time period, right? And so, like in the documentary, we see that the British actually introduced it as a full-on drug. It was used as a sort of medicinal purpose, but it wasn't in any way had the sort of addictive quality, had the sort of widespread societal problem, right? So in Massachusetts, where the profits from opium go? We have some of those answers, right, in that first slide. So if you've ever heard of the Boston Brahmins, it's the traditional sort of Boston upper class, the WASP, right, the wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? So they talked about Delano, right? So John Kerry actually comes from this lineage, right, of people, right? Those like Forbes, right? Forbes, Delano, FDR, like all those people are actually related to these people who built their wealth off of opium. And white Anglo-Saxon Protestants so dominated U.S. society, culture, politics, right, for since the beginning, right? And then of course they maintain their status and power through intermarriage, inheritance, nepotism. There's these fascinating family trees where you see everyone's just sort of like marrying into each other in order to keep that wealth within their family. This is for students, right? In case they're like, what is nepotism, right? So it's, all these names should sound familiar because they are all over Boston, right? And this is a very, this particular text is linked in our curated resources, but this quote, the principal sources of wealth and power were provided to them by the British, chiefly the British East India Company, most notably profits of piracy and of massive accumulations gained from both the African slave trade and the Far East opium traffic, right? So this picture is a picture of this guy, Thomas Handsid Perkins. He was like one of the opium masterminds that was based in Boston. So, Perkins School for the Blind, like that's the same family, right? Okay. So again, these names sound familiar because we see them all over Boston. And actually it's not just Boston, it's Massachusetts, it's New York, it's Pennsylvania, right? So a lot of very much East Coast, very much like the quote unquote beginning founding of this country were built on that. And just real quick, the Lowell Mills, right? So like it funded a lot of like the industrialization, right? In Lowell, right? So a lot of this money channeled right into factories, the cotton was from the South, right? So this is all very, very, very interconnected, this history.
Can I add one thing? Where the British also wanted to control necessarily without getting anything in return or giving anything was Yemen and Aden. Actually, they brought a form of a drug. It wasn't opium, the seed. It was called qat, and they gave it to people for free. And it made people sleepy and lethargic. And it wasn't until they revolted in the late 50s, early 60s, I think. And that's one reason Yemen will remain a place they fight it, because it's a corner they want, for war, for trade, for whatever. So what they do is actually they destroy the whole society through that. I remember as a child seeing pictures of men and women sitting on chairs, kind of long chairs, sleepy, just looking completely dopey. The British and the Americans, God, can we do something about it?
Actually, those the strategies sound really similar to what we know had happened to what we know has happened in China. They gave out free pipes, right? The British gave out free pipes. They gave like discounts to people who were first-time users, right? Like this is, and it was illegal in China, right? And so here we go. So what are we doing? Okay. So like I said, it's really interwoven with with human trafficking, right? And drug trafficking is very, very interwoven in terms of profits. So why is it that they switched from human trafficking to drug trafficking, right? So there are a couple of reasons. The Perkins family has this humongous plantation in what is now known as Haiti, right? At the time, the Haitian Revolution was fighting off colonial rule, and they were successful, right? And so that whole compound, their whole trading post in Haiti was taken over. And so they were like, can't trade there anymore. Oh, what's the next thing? The next thing, right? In 1807, also the U.S. abolishes the Atlantic slave trade. It still happens illegally, but it's a little bit more difficult to do, right? So people are sort of looking around and saying like, what else could we invest in? And they, of course, decide that China is an easy target. It's an easy way to sort of like try to figure out what a place where we could invest money in, right? And of course, why opium? Right? It's a drug. It's not like Layla was saying, like it has these kinds of drugs have major effects on people in a society. At one point, it was 10% of the Chinese population that was addicted, right? It's for money, right? It's again for profit. So we'll look a little bit more into that. Here's a quick review. This is again a student-facing slide meant for folks to show students, right? So a quick review. Tell me, what are these three things here that you see China is exporting to the world that everyone wants? Shout it out.
Tea.
Tea. Sorry, again. What else?
Silk.
Silk. This last one is porcelain, right? So, why do we call something China? Why do we call porcelain China? It's because literally it was from there, right? It was, so people probably know, right? All these things were being exported out of China to other countries. Other countries really wanted these things because they were really high quality, they were really sought after. And of course, you've probably heard of English tea, right? Tea time, right? So this is a coupling literally of porcelain and tea. You've probably seen movies where, or maybe been to museums where you've seen sort of the silk on the, the gowns of women in Europe and Britain. And all this was from China, right? All of these materials were from China. And so what happens is that, in a trade is like, you give something to me, I give something to you. That's what trade means, right? And so of course, Britain was like, well, we want to actually trade stuff with you. We don't want to have to like just give you money, right? So they were like, well, how about some wool? We've got wool. Like, you want wool from our sheep? And China's kind of like, not really. Like, we're not really interested in wool, right? And so they're like, okay, fine, we'll give you silver. Silver, interestingly, the origins of silver is it's Spanish bullion, which was taken from civilizations in South America, right? So through their colonial exploits, right? So this is all just very, very intermeshed and connected. But they said, okay, so will you take silver? And the Chinese were like, yes, that's exactly what we want. We want silver. We don't want any of your wool. We don't want any of the goods that you have. There's really nothing we're interested in except for silver, right? So of course, the British are like, well, that's no good. Like, that's super expensive. Like, we can't just give you silver for like all this stuff that we want for tea that you're just like reproducing constantly. Why don't we, I know, right? They have an idea and they're like, great, we'll use our colony. They had a colony in India. We'll grow opium there and then we'll import that into China. We'll smuggle it into China. China at the time was like, no, like that's illegal. Like, we don't want that tea. No good, right? Like, that is not tea. That is, I mean, we don't want that. We don't want that opium. That is no good. That is a drug. It's like making our society fall apart. Forget it. And so at the same time, right around that time, the United States actually also became a country, right? And they said, okay, we're just going to follow in the footsteps of Britain, and we're going to also import or smuggle drugs into the country, opium into the country, right? And so at that time, of course, the United States does not have a colony in India, and the British are monopolizing that area in India to grow opium. And so they decided to go into Turkey, set up shop there and import opium from Turkey, which was considered a lower quality, but then, they made At one point, the United States was, it was about 10% of the opium trade, right? So it was a pretty significant portion, and most of it was from New England. Most of it was from Boston, New York, Pennsylvania, mainly Boston, a lot of folks in Boston. So of course, China gets super mad and is like, heck no, we don't want you and United States to also now put more opium into our country. We got to do something about it, right? So here's the Chinese's response.
Today in China, the story of the opium trade and the resulting opium wars with England, America, and the Western powers is told at a museum. It is built on the site where the Chinese destroyed the opium seized from Western traders. Over the vast plaza of the museum presides the figure of Commissioner Lin. He was sent by his emperor from Peking to Canton to stop the use and sales of opium.
是呢個詞咧，就係好嚟燒嗰啲鴉片煙嘅，將英國政府所運嚟嘅鴉片煙，通通集中在呢個地方進行焚燒。唔係，佢一定要燒咗佢，一定要燒啊！英國政府咧，當時咧清朝政府就唔俾佢燒，燒毀佢，唔好俾佢流傳喺呢度咧，就喺民間啊，就毒害村民。
Yes, our Commissioner Lin was uncompromising. To Queen Victoria of England, Commissioner Lin addressed her conscience. We have heard that in your honorable nation, too, that people are not permitted to smoke the drug, and that offenders expose themselves to sure punishment. And finally, with the Western traders who had flooded China with opium, Lin took lightning action. Surrender your balls of opium to us, he demanded. Listening to our soldiers beating gongs and blowing conch shells all night, the foreign traders quickly agreed to surrender their opium, but did not actually do so. Our Commissioner Lin then built a wall around the factories, and after 39 more days as prisoners, the foreign traders gave up their poisonous opium to be destroyed.
Okay, so we saw how the Chinese resisted this illegal opium smuggling by the British and by the Americans. And on the right-hand side, we see an excerpt from a letter that was actually sent to Queen Victoria protesting the opium smuggling that was happening. Yeah.
So just a quick continuation.
Okay.
For this, the British wanted war.
But a war could not be declared over opium, an illicit, illegal, contraband commodity. The British Parliament couldn't certainly declare war with China over an illegal drug. An excuse had to be found.
Jardine and Matheson of Hong Kong, two men prominently trafficking in opium who had become members of Parliament, presented the excuse. The Chinese character E meant barbarian. Barbarian was used to describe Europeans. Europeans thought it was arrogant and insulting. China was deemed unfit to be a member of the family of nations. and former American President John Quincy Adams also leapt in to agree with the British. China had a moral obligation to trade with nations because commerce was founded entirely on the Christian precept to love your neighbor as yourself. China's refusal to trade was an enormous outrage and should cease.
China had to be taught a lesson.
The British attack in China began. Our weapons were no match for theirs. We thought ourselves in need of nothing from the West. We were wrong. We needed their cannons. The invasion of Peking was an Allied invasion, British and French together. And when Lord Elgin ordered the burning of the Imperial Summer Palace, our emperor gave in. China lost the 2 Opium Wars. China lost too much. No sooner than the Treaty of Nanjing between Britain and China was signed, the Americans also maneuvered a separate U.S.-China treaty to wrest the same treaty benefits for themselves. And soon after this, across the Yellow Sea in Japan, learning from this experience in China, America sent Matthew Perry sailing into Tokyo Bay with his warships to force open Japan as well to trade. The Japanese did not like Perry or his American fleet. They called them the Black Ships. We lost Hong Kong and Kowloon to Queen Victoria and her successors. We had to open 12 treaty ports to Westerners, not just one in Canton as before. And in these treaty ports, Westerners were allowed to inhabit privileged parts of the city, separate from Chinese society, not subject to Chinese law. American Christian missionaries were now free to move anywhere in China in search of our heathen souls to save. We were no longer equal. We lost control in our own land. But most faithfully of all, the British were now given the power to preside over the immigration of our people abroad, hitherto illegal, so that when the African slave trade ended, all the world could freely come to the treaty ports to find and export Chinese laborers on a global scale. That is how the Chinese laborer, industrious and honorable, became the Chinese coolie, someone both sought after and despised.
All right, so in this slide, in this video section, we were able to see the response of Britain to the Chinese resistance to the opium smuggling. As the video talks about, right, this is the period of the unequal treaties in China, which extends to other places like Japan. And shortly after the first Opium War, the US actually is able to sign its own unequal treaty with China without having to fight a war. So we have another summary we can run through. Yeah, I can't, yeah, okay. All right. So here we are right before the Opium War. where the Chinese are protesting and resisting the British smuggling of opium into China. They confiscate and capture the opium, they destroy it, and this makes the British really, really angry, right? Destroying their profits. 20,000 chests of opium. All right. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties.
I can just start hard.
Yeah.
Just mute yourself.
Okay.
All right, so British are like, no way, right? You're not gonna burn all of our opium, literally, like Commissioner Lin burns all their opium, right? Destroys it. And the British are like, we're sending in warships, right? We're gonna make sure that this quote unquote trade can happen between us. We're gonna make sure that China didn't want to open their treaties, didn't want to open their trading posts with the rest of the world, right? They were forced to open. So British are like, we're gonna force you to trade with us. So they're like, we're gonna make opium even more opium. We're gonna trade even more opium with you. And at that point, China is defeated, right? They don't have the sort of like the war capabilities, the cannons to be able to match the British. And so it turns into this century of humiliation of unequal treaties, right? And so this is like a really poignant kind of like part of to understand like really the effects, right? What actually was signed away. So when we talk about the Treaty of Nanking, what did the British force China to do? They forced them to open these ports that they didn't want to open, right? They got rid of this system for foreign trade that was controlled by the Chinese. They limit the amount of customs duty China can even charge for any foreign countries. They pay an indemnity, right? So they pay to compensate for the opium that was burned, right? So 21 million silver dollars they make them pay, right? They give control of land to the British, Hong Kong. That's how Hong Kong becomes a colony. They allow for Christian missionaries to come in and preach, and that has major effects later on. Even like there's a rebellions where like there was this guy essentially that got converted to Christianity, thought he was a brother of Jesus Christ, and led the Taiping Revolution or rebellion, and that like actually killed millions and millions of people. And so this is like doesn't just end with this treaty, right? The effects of it, and then of course this last one, which is extraterritoriality, which essentially is like, if you're a foreigner in a Western foreigner in China, you don't follow the laws. If you kill someone, you're tried by your own country. You're not tried by China, right? So it's essentially the Chinese are relegated to second-class citizenship in their own country, right? They become colonized. The United States jumps on that bandwagon real quick. They're like, awesome, we don't even have to fight a war, but we're gonna also make our own treaty with China, and we're gonna take everything that the British are doing, and then also kind of like put on our own like more detailed things of like how we're able to buy land at treaty ports and build hospitals and churches. And actually, a lot of American missionaries went into China. And so in this graph you see in the pink kind of is with the first opium war, the treaty ports that are forced open by the British, right? And then not long later, there's another opium war. And in this opium war, the French decide to come in too and also get rights, right? So again, opium is made legal in China, right? As something that they can trade. There's Kowloon, so not only Hong Kong, but also Kowloon is given to the British. And then again, more missionaries can come in, and the French and the British occupy Canton for a few years. And they actually burn like the Summer Palace. That's, if you look into, it's like fascinating also to see like, that if you go to those places, they're either empty or they're burned to the ground, right? And so a lot of those things actually exist in other countries, in museums and people's private homes, right? Like a lot of those things are spread around the world. Right? Do you want to talk through this or colonialism? Just look at my screen.
Okay. All right. So what we are seeing happening in China is what happened in so many other places of the world, right? This is called colonialism. And this is the definition that the Ethnic Studies Curriculum Writing Group put together for students. It's a system and ideas that make normal, dominating, and controlling people who, that makes normal, dominating and controlling people who are seen as inferior in order to justify occupation of land, control of resources, economy, and politics for the benefit of the colonizer. So how is this case study an example of colonialism? And we've compiled a bunch of contemporary as well as historical quotes and a bunch of other resources that teachers can use in the course of teaching a unit on colonialism or on specifically the Opium Wars and British and American colonialism in China. There's a link down at the bottom left of this slide, but we will also provide it to you later that links to the case study. So it's not just this slide deck and these quotes, but also a bunch of other resources, scholarly articles, secondary sources, etc., that teachers can use and kind of plug in to make a unit that works for them and for their students. So things that teachers could do include DBQs, right, for like history, structured academic controversies, which are very structured kind of debate structures that teachers can use. They can have students make essays, they can have students make comics, etc.
Can I say one thing about this, if y'all don't mind? I feel like there's such a horrible and interesting parallel. Some people say that this is a conspiracy, but I believe that there's some truth to it, to the way that crack cocaine was intentionally brought into Black communities in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States to destabilize them. I feel like that's a parallel that's really important to think about. And then secondarily, Peter, I think earlier said like wars in Afghanistan. And like, how perverse is it that the United States turns around and says, you know, oh, this opium is coming from these places and we need a war on drugs to do that. And moreover, like furthermore, how the US intervention in the Middle East is for those same reasons, like to open up markets, right? Like the same things that Katie was saying earlier, that it, you know, there was basically immunity for any you know, Westerners, quote unquote, that were in China and all of that. Like we see those same things in Afghanistan and Iraq today.
Also, I could add that US used Turkey to flood the Arab world, especially Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan, with drugs after people revolted against the US activities there. And this is only in the last 40 years. And now it's very easy to get anything you want on the market. And the Israeli army brings it in and out. It goes all over. The US Army members bring the drugs right in their Jeeps and trucks and maybe in airplanes like they did in Central America. I don't know.
Yeah, so this is exactly what's supposed to happen, right? When you're learning about this, it's not just this one historical case study. It's like this has a thread throughout history, like the tactics, the reasons they're doing this, right, are they echo, right? And so it's really important to sort of draw, especially, you know, especially in the ethnic studies space, like really important to draw sort of the line between past and present and through, right? So that's not just, you know, this could be a history class and just be like this case study and that's it, right? But being able to sort of draw that line through to current contemporary movements and seeing contemporary events and seeing like, just this, isn't this the same thing happening? That's exactly what so ethnic studies does, right? Okay.
And also I would say drawing connections to other communities and histories of your students, you know, like this is not just isolated to China, right? This is connected directly to the Atlantic slave trade. It's connected to colonialism in India. It's connected to colonialism in the Middle East, as well as Africa directly, right? South America is where the silver came from. And then a little bit later, Mexico is where the silver came from. It is all interconnected, right? This drive for profit above all else, profit above people. All right, and so as Katie was saying, right, this is not something that is just isolated in history or, you know, around, regardless of whether wherever it was in the world, it's still continuing today. And the opium wars and the opium trade have direct connections to people's lives today.
So this quote is really much.
This quote is really much, you know, really similar to what Layla was speaking about, right? Like the effects of opium with people. It's like, this was like in that time, right? This is like what would happen to families, right? What happened to communities. And today we think, oh, maybe that's just something that happened in the past and it has no effects to what happened today, right? And in fact, it actually does. So I'm going to read this quote because it's actually my quote. So my parents were born in a colony of the British, Hong Kong, right? And I'll just read my quote. In my family, I often wondered why we didn't give offerings and worship our ancestors like so many of generations of ancestors had before us. I wasn't even sure what to do with incense. When I asked, I was told it was because we were Catholic. I didn't make the connection until I realized that my parents had grown up in Hong Kong, a British colony, and studied in Catholic missionary schools, probably being told that traditions practiced for generations by her ancestors were going to send her to hell. My mom, right? We bear so many losses in the name of colonialism. And then this is an interesting quote. I asked for his permission and he allowed me to share it. It's Tommy Chang, who many of you may know was one of the superintendents of Boston Public Schools before Superintendent Cassellius. And in a conversation that he had with me and Go, he said, I just realized I don't even know enough Chinese to know how to read the words on my father's grave or death certificate, right? And so Tommy is actually on a journey right now. He's about to embark in the summer to go back to Asia and to sort of rediscover and reconnect with his roots. So I think part of it is a lifelong of learning and reconnecting and trying to figure out, you know, like what do we do about these consequences that have that reverberate today in our lives, in our existence. Right?
And we also, like, I don't know if the children would be able to do this, but link this to the demonization of China today, and how
the trade wars.
They want to control the world, and it's the opposite. But children don't know that. I mean, and I don't know how we can bring this up, but it has to be linked somehow.
Yeah, so we're going to try to make a little bit of that link. For some of you who might not know who this is Jose Antonio Vargas. He is.
That's what I am.
He's
what I am sometimes. And I was just.
He's a Filipino American, Asian American activist. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he's undocumented. And so he speaks a little bit about his experience.
Telling Tom earlier today, I was in North Carolina recently to show the film, and a gentleman who was a little belligerent said to me, because I said there's 4 million Filipinos in America, and he was like, "That's a lot." I'm like, okay. Why are there so many of you here? And he didn't say that in a welcoming way. And I was tired, it was late, and so all I can say to him, you know, sir, you know, we're here because you were there. That's why we're here. We're here because you were there. And he was like, what? Read The Economist. No, I'm just like, I mean, you know, it's like, I don't. In the film, by the way, the only way I could talk about that was the first 2 lines. So growing up in the Philippines, I always knew I was coming to America. America was inevitable. That was the only way in the film, without like shouldering too much already, I could address, you know, what this codependency has been, right? And you can do the same thing with Guatemala, with Nicaragua, with the history of Vietnam, with, you know, that. And we don't talk about immigration in that way.
This quote of him, "We are here because you were there," right? And so we'll dive into that a little deeper. so the question of like, what is he talking about? Like, why are Asians here, right? So just as, so again, this is assuming a little bit out and saying this is beyond China, right? And in fact, the film doesn't even beyond Asians in this documentary. They talk about it. So this is a great film to sort of link with your students. Like, what are we talking about here? We're looking at this case study of China, but it is actually speaking about many, 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 many of our experiences of how we got here.
So how did Asians become a part of the American scene? See, Europeans were looking for Asia when they stumbled into the landmass we call the Americas today. We frequently forget that Christopher Columbus sailed west looking for Cathay, for China, for the trade.
And he thinks he's found Japan. And he's asking the local Arawak Indians, well, how do I get to India? And he thinks that they're telling him what's the next island over.
The voyages of exploration during the 15th century were mediated by the Roman Catholic Church. In a papal bull, the world, as it was known then, was divided between Portugal and Spain. And as a curious idea that the indigenous peoples don't matter, and that the land could be simply divided.
Why did we come to America? Look not to Asia for the reason. Look to the West.
Asian emigration had as much to do with developments in Europe as it did with developments in the Americas or in Asia. Overseas migrations was part of their colonizing efforts in different parts of the world.
America may think immigrants always come to get something from America, from the West, and take it away. But really, it was very different.
East is east, and west is west, and ne'er the twain shall meet.
But we did meet. Long before Asians immigrated, when East met West, it was the West that came to us. The British came to India and took India. The Spaniards came to the Philippines and took the Philippines. The Portuguese took Formosa and Goa. The Dutch took Indonesia. The French took all of Indochina. Not to be outdone, the Japanese took Korea, later Taiwan, and tried to take China. The United States took Hawaii and took the Philippines from Spain. These were the beginnings of how East met West. And in the New World, too, Britain took Trinidad and Jamaica and British Guiana in South America. The Dutch were next door with Suriname, and the French with French Guiana, Haiti, and Martinique. Spaniards took most of South America, leaving only Brazil for the Portuguese. So when we Chinese and Asian Indians left our beloved homelands, shipped as indentured laborers across the ocean to get to the New World, the strange and hard New World, we from the East again met the West, who now became overlords and owners of our labor. And we gave them the sugar, cocoa, and cotton the colonial masters sold to the world.
Okay. And so just like so many other places in the world, we see how colonialism plays out, not just in the countries that were colonized, right? But how the labor is used in different parts of the world. So with the decline of the slave trade, the investors and the capitalists needed additional labor to work the sugar plantations, the cotton fields, et cetera. And so they bring coolies over from China and from India to replace Black and indigenous workers who have died And so this is one of the main reasons why there are Asians in the Americas. First, the countries were destabilized, were colonized, and then the labor was imported to make money for the colonizers in the Americas. There are studies looking at the ships that brought the coolies over from India and from China, and the mortality rates were actually quite similar to the Atlantic slave trade. In addition, the mortality rates for coolies who actually made it to the Americas, to Peru, to Cuba, to many other places, that mortality rate was actually extremely, extremely high. So somewhere in between 50 and 75%, depending on which sources you look at and depending on which regions you look at, 50 to 75% of coolies died before they completed their contract. All right. So here's a quote from Pulitzer Prize winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen. The United States is a colonizing country. The difference is that Americans call their colonialism the American dream. My very existence and that of many other Vietnamese and Asian Americans in this country, we are here because of wars that the United States fought in Asia. And I would add, right, so many different groups of people, not just Asians, not just Vietnamese, not just Chinese, are here because of wars that the United States and other Western countries fought in Africa and South America and the Caribbean, many other places. Okay, so we have a map to show you, right? This is a map of United States military bases right at the end of World War II. Take a look. So as you can see, right, this shows a little bit about the location where the United States fought wars, both big and small, or had military interventions in different countries. And a lot of these places have sent quite a large number of people to the United States. Right? This is kind of a map of US empire, US military intervention. And if this were any other country, I think that most Americans would question why does this country need to have so many bases all over the world? But for us in the United States, this is not something that we talk about in terms of our education. But if it comes up in the news, it's seen as normal, it's seen as natural, it's seen as something that's there to protect us.
So in just a straight history classroom, you might just you might do sort of like a historical analysis of this. You might do sort of like a, look at more maps. You might do some analysis, but in ethnic studies classroom, it's really important to sort of draw the line to our own lives, right? And so this map and everything we've shown you so far should bring up questions. Hopefully it brings up questions about sort of your own lives, right? Of like why you might be here, your own family, how they got here, what they own maybe even, and their actual lived experiences every day. So we're actually gonna break people up into groups and just have a conversation about what questions does this bring up for you as you're going through, as so far, there's probably like a lot of information, but I think really important to make the connection to your own lives. So Molly, can I ask you to help us break into groups of like maybe 3?
Absolutely.
Thanks. So we'll have about, let's say ish 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back.
Katie, before we go, do you want 3 groups or groups of 3?
Groups of 3, sorry, small groups, so people
No.
can actually answer this question. What questions does this bring up for you, your own family? How they got here, what they own, their lived experiences. What kinds of questions does it bring up for yourself?
Okay, sounds good. I'll bring people back and then put them in groups of 3. One sec. It's doing the 20-second count back.
Okay.
Thanks for everyone's patience. It should be open now.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much. Hopefully you got a little space to process and to think about sort of how that connects with your own life. We're going to continue sharing screen and making deeper connections. Let me go ahead and do that right now. Okay. Yeah, so here's where we're leaving off, and the question that I'm curious about sort of if folks want to share anything that came up for them, maybe something that you've never really thought about before, but answering this question, right? So given what we've learned so far in the session, and looking at this map, especially and understanding US colonialism and its consequences and effects, what kinds of questions did it bring up for you? Maybe things that you wanted to know more about or you never thought about.
I think I'll say one thing, the link between colonialism and liberalism and current governments is very, very strong, that they just have crossed over seamlessly, from one extreme to the next. And people accept this liberalism because it doesn't look as bad. It's all about trade and, American dream and democracy and all that nonsense. But it's really about control of resources, movement, and wealth.
Building on that, I think it's so interesting, with this year's inaugural address, how Biden, I think it was the first inaugural address where people were talking about white supremacy. And yet he didn't refer to the military at all, even though it's like the biggest chunk of our tax dollars and budget. And I guess one of the things that I shared in the breakout room was how multiple generations of my family have been displaced and or ended up meeting from different backgrounds because of war and connections to military.
I spent a lot of time this last year thinking about my dad, who grew up who was born during World War II, but grew up in occupied Japan. And just thinking about how he kind of absorbed this idea that America was this amazing, country, this land of opportunity. And and just thinking about the influence of Japan's defeat in the war, right? The American occupation of Japan and the American propaganda that he was subject to growing up there, and how it affected his ideas about the US.
Maybe we'll take one more person, one brave soul.
I was thinking how I always in discussions like this get stuck on the American dream, just because I was raised and brought up with that as the foundation of why I'm here and why my family thrived. So, you know, it's an emotional thing. I think I get caught up intellectually. I can wrap my head around the discourse, but then emotionally it tugs at me that I feel like I'm somehow betraying my parents if I embrace some larger notion of what the American dream really represents. So I often get stuck right about at this point, sort of emotionally.
Yeah, and I think, Alicia, what you're bringing up is, you know, in an ethnic studies space, we need to process that and yet, you know, think about, right, that, right, and feel that, right? Because I think that that emotional stuckness is actually where it stops us from making these connections, right? And not only connections with each other here, but also with our own families, right? Like, so, like I was sharing earlier how my grandfather, when asked, you know, well, you have all these descendants here and, you know, like they're like lawyers and they, you know, they have like professions and, you know, like we're teachers, I'm a teacher, right? And aren't you happy that we're here? And he was like, I was like, would you have come here? You know, like he's like in his 90s, right? But I was like, would you have come here if you had known all that? He said no, right? He was really, really honest. And he said no, you know, and I think he got very emotional when he was telling me, but when he admitted that, right? But I think part of it is like, how can you admit that when that's the internalization that we have that makes our existence what it is? You know, like it's like to not deny that would be like to actually have to face what actually brought us here and the losses that we face, right? And so, you know, we always want these kinds of spaces to hold people, right? And their everything, their experiences, their everything. And that's really the kind of space that, you know, that is different from like a history space or different from an ELA space that an ethics studies space has for people. Okay, everyone take a deep breath. That was a lot of like going into self. And we're going to talk a little bit about just, you know, just to bring it back to sort of theoretical and to drive this point home, right? So why are there so many military bases? Why are there so many wars and interventions and assassinations? Why was the United States there? Right? And so we're going to circle it back to, it was money. Yeah, it is money. It is about control of wealth and resources. And it is this, you know, it is tied to colonialism. And it happens not only in the past, but it happens today, as consequences today from the past. And it continues to happen today. Colonialism continues to happen today to peoples, right, around the world. To which we always ask, isn't this really depressing? Like, why are we talking about colonialism, right? Isn't talking about oppression depressing? Which I always love to show this quote. It's a professor of ethnic studies. She's on the East Coast now. And so she says, people always come to me and saying things like, isn't it so depressing to constantly teach and talk about oppression? To which I immediately respond, not as nearly as depressing as suffering from depression, not being able to name it. So this idea is that when we know things, what do we do now, right? Because you can't even begin to address something unless you actually know it's a problem. And for US empire, as we said, it's invisible, right? The Boston institutions that we walk around seeing, it's invisible, right? If you look at this map of these black outlines right here, often we think of the United States just as this thing on the right, this big landmass on the right, when in fact, it also includes all these little dots. And what those all little dots are actually US empire, they're colonies in the United States or have been in the past, right? So if we were actually be clear about what the United States is, then we actually have to face this history and current reality of colonialism. Because part of resistance is being able to clearly see and identify the problem. You can't actually resist anything that you don't realize exists, right? So it begins with us making things visible to ourselves and to each other and making sense of that. Okay, so we are ending a little bit early, which is fine, but we wanted to go around in sort of an open space and talk a little bit about, as you're leaving, like what is something you're thinking about or feeling right now, given all the information that we went through. And feel free to like speak and then pass it on to someone as we're closing out this space today.
Well, I'll take the liberty of starting here. Katie, thank you so much. Go. Thank you for creating this space. For myself, where I'm left right now is I'm making the connection to the anti-Confederate movement in America, where they're looking at institutions and statues and artifacts and vestiges of Confederate power and looking at changing names, bringing down statues. And I think there's been chat in the chat box, there's been mentioned that certain schools, for instance, I do know, I think the Perkin School for the Blind, but also even BPS schools that may be named after families who are burnt beneficiaries of this, if not blood money, but certainly opium money or money that resulted from exploitation and violence and so on. So it just makes me think, I know we may have bigger fish to fry today, but at some point, it's important to straighten out the history, right? At some point, it's important to reckon with the powers that be and say, why are you proudly displaying your school's name, right? Maybe the Perkins School for the Blind ought to have a footnote on its webpage and say, by the way, we acknowledge that this institution was endowed with money obtained from the opium trade, right? And okay, we're not going to ask you for reparation, but at least let's get the history straight, right? Maybe we're not going to force you to change your name, but let's get the history straight. Let's put on that asterisk right on your webpage, right? I don't know. That's just where I am right this moment. Thanks.
Richard, you want to pass it to someone?
Sorry, let's see. On my screen, let me just go, is Camille is on my screen, so.
Thank you, Richard. That was brilliant to make those connections. And I identify as a part of my identity as an Indigenous woman. And it's fraught with all of that, the mascot names and so on and so forth. And since I can remember, Indigenous scholars have been fighting against that. And finally, it's made some headway. So that momentum, the NAACP was doing this decades ago, it's not revisionist history so much, it's getting it right. And so I appreciate what you said, Richard, and I'm going to go with that. Thanks for sharing. And my next person is Alicia, so I'm just going to pass it off to Alicia.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate all of the comments and the space too. I'm still stuck on my mother. I'm thinking about my mother. But she used to always, I would always complain as a kid, all my white friends, their mothers are saying their kids are great. They do everything. They don't even they don't do anything. They just stand there and they get told they're great and wonderful and all this other things. And you're always, telling me I'm not doing this right or not good enough, and she would say to me, she said, I'm the only one who could tell you these things. No one else is gonna tell you except for me. So appreciate it. And I kind of feel that way about, sort of the work that we're doing is it's my country. This is the only, I have no other country. This is where I am committed to, I live, and I hope my children to thrive. So, I feel like kind of like my mother, like if I don't say these things about my country and work to make it better because it's not good enough, who else is gonna, so thanks, Mom. I pass to Alan, Elaine. Yeah.
Okay, so the thing that I'm thinking is, I'm not surprised you've had so much resistance to being able to do this kind of teaching. I think you're going to get a lot more resistance to it. I think it's one thing to say BPS should be an anti-racist district. It's a very different thing to actually mean it. Actually, I'm surprised you haven't had more than you've had. And I will pass it to Jean Wu.
Jean, are you able to join us today speaking, or you might not be?
Oh, okay. Layla?
Yes, I think one of the things that strikes me every time we do ethnic studies together as a group through the last 3 years is how little the general public knows about our struggles, Palestinian struggle, Asian struggles, African immigrants, Native. And I think one of the things also is that's really important, we need to push for that. Books, I collected a large number of books on different ethnicities to introduce my students to that ethnicity and to help them understand the other people in the room if they happen to be there, or just learn about something else. And it wasn't welcome. Or the whole time I was teaching, people will tell me, oh, that's not important, Oh, you want to talk about Palestine? I'm reading a story. It's a story about cats. Yes, it happens to be Palestinian. And I think Asians have been neglected as well in a big way. It's like Asians are successful, they're doing well, that myth, So they kind of actually brush them aside and push them out of the way. We get demonized, so it's easy for me to kind of stick my head up and try to defend myself. But a lot of Asians I noticed that I've met in schools tend to be quiet, docile, and don't stand up. And I think it's that is harmful as well, Intersectionality, again, is really important. And we have to work on it. We have to work on curriculum for the younger kids. We've got to start from the young because they form these ideas from their surroundings, from their parents, from their friends, from society. And we can't wait until 6th grade to say, we've got to save these kids. They have to think and they have to question. They got to start younger. That's what I'm taking away from this.
Layla, do you want to pass to someone? You were mute when you passed it, so just, you're mute. You're unmute.
I muted myself. Molly?
Oh, thank you, Layla. I'm feeling really grateful for two elements of ethnic studies pedagogy that struck me about this experience. And one of them is that when we're talking about this history, we're also talking about colonialism, that we're analyzing the power relationships that existed within this history. When you pose the questions to us, Katie, to think about our own family's heritage in relationship to what we were learning about, I was thinking about how part of my family's Scottish, and Scottish people went from being colonized by the Brits to what is called Canada and North America, to violently colonize and assimilate Indigenous people there in what's now called Nova Scotia. And I think that us having an understanding of and talking about colonization and settler colonialism is what separates it from understanding our own, like the violence our own families and communities experience, and also how that's related to other communities' struggles, so that we don't turn around like Scottish people have and perpetuate that. And that's kind of connected to another thing I'm grateful for about this space, is that it's also like a feeling space where we're trying to get like in our bodies and feel how it feels to talk about this stuff. And to remember or learn this stuff. And I appreciated, Alicia, the way that you brought that in. And I think that like, that's a big part of like, in thinking about, you know, that legacy of violence that is connected to my heritage, is like feeling that and not dissociating from that, and feeling what that compels me to then do. And it reminded me too of what you shared, Richard, of us not dissociating from the heritage of the names that we talk about every day in BPS that we send people to, or the names of sports teams, and not dissociating from the violence of how they're connected to colonization happening now and that's been happening. So yeah, thank you, Katie and Go, and to everybody here for those two pieces. And I'll pass it to Go.
I think I just kind of want to echo Molly a little bit about what you said, Alicia. I'm a biology teacher by day, and although we do talk about a variety of things, not just biology, I think that deliberately making space for our own selves, our histories, and our emotions, I think is really, really important, and it's not something that students often do. And I think that's one of the great things about this kind of pedagogy. Robert.
Well, it's been mentioned several times, but I feel like the most important thing for all of us as teachers and for everyone in this country is the history, the true history of what's happened to African Americans, to Indigenous people, to Asians, throughout the history of this country, which has basically tells us a lot about what's happening today and why it's happening. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful to this presentation, because I learned a lot about Boston, the city that I live in, and some of the incredible things that these buildings are named after, and the oppression and invasion of China. I had no knowledge of that whatsoever, so you added tremendously to my understanding of history. Thank you.
You want to pass it to someone, Robert?
Oh, Catherine?
Thanks, Robert. I, as always, feeling very, very grateful for time spent in ethnic studies space and like deepening my understanding of history in the world. Thanks for what y'all share. And echoing Layla's sentiments, my first year working full time with fifth and sixth grade, and wanting to bring these frameworks and things to the younger kids. And also sort of building on what Molly said, just this has sparked a lot of interesting reflections about my own family and the term American dream. I spent a lot, my parents, my dad grew up overseas in Japan because of his father, and not directly because of military, but my grandfather initially was moving around a lot because of military. And as I said before, there's many generations of displacement because of military, and then before that, because of Europeans doing European shit, just going all over the place. And I think I spent a long time like really mourning the lack of attachment to place, especially like when I traveled to Cameroon the first time and someone asked me where was my village, like my ancestral village, and I was like, oh shit, I don't have anything like that in my life, you know? But I feel today like real gratitude to my parents, even though like my dad went back to Japan after being sent here to study in the United States because he felt like more home there than he did here. And my mother ended up on an internship there. And that's how they met. And she, like my father, felt alienated from the United States by like, for her, it was like Cold War rhetoric and moving from the unsegregated, I'm bringing this to a point, sorry, unsegregated West Virginia to segregated West Virginia, and being really shaken by that because of the strong friendship she'd had as a kid with Black kids. And anyway, I hated a long time that we moved here because it's a fucked up place to move as a small child in the United States, especially like the vibes were so much better in Japan. But I do feel grateful to them that like they gave me a critical lens towards this place. Yeah, I'm feeling grateful for that. For knowing that the American dream was a nightmare for so many. Yeah. That sounds like a weird thing to be grateful for. But anyway, I will pass it to JD.
Word, I appreciate that. Peace, everybody. Yeah, no, I'm thinking of a lot. Yeah, definitely first things first. Thank you to Katie, Go, everyone else, people who I don't know, but were a part of really, bringing this together. And I hate that I missed the first hour, but you know what? I made it for what I did. And, I'm just thinking about how we're like, colonized and oppressed peoples, there's I oftentimes think about whether I'm talking with, like, say, some of my buddies or even with students sometimes, how because we've experienced so much, whether it's through like generations and like the effects of that, or just very directly, and we're trying to process so much of our like trauma and pain, or at least we want to. It may not have necessarily. May not have all the exact guidance or direction on how to do that, but I mention that because sometimes when it comes to struggle, right, and organizing, it may often result in a lot of, as we all know, like blaming each other for being victims and survivors of colonialism, right, and colonial conditioning. And sometimes completely discarding, even if that discardment or discarding comes in the form of just being ignorant to the rich history of solidarity. And through that is struggle, meaning it's not all good, quote unquote good, but but it's a struggle of like, how do we work through whatever issues we may have, and unite around our points of commonality, and ultimately for this greater purpose that's bigger and greater than any of us as individuals, or even individual peoples, right? And so I just think about that because trying to, for me as an educator, as an organizer, and just as as a conscious African and Black person, of really thinking about a subjective quality of humility in like learning from those who come before me, who have made it clear that they want us to learn from not only their successes, but their shortcomings and their mistakes and their failures as well, with the hopes that we don't repeat it. So I'm thinking about that a lot as I think through like just the energy and passion and knowledge that a lot of my students or our students and our young people have, and like how do we support them in that with the encouragement to say like we gotta really look to our past as well. Like that's not optional. And if we do that, then colonialism has to, because colonialism is a central part of it, like has to be a central part of the conversation and truly understanding what that means and that material force, you know, as opposed to merely fighting for, I don't know, like ideas in our head or other subjective factors, which might be important, but it's really like, it's ultimately like politics is power, and like how do we have power over our own lives. And so, yeah, I just really appreciate being able to think through that with you all in this space tonight. And with that, I'll pass it to my man Cecil.
Oh, word. Here we go. Thank you, JD, and everybody. You know, I'm thinking definitely about others' comments, Richard, Go, Molly, and others around, you know, public spaces, whether it's schools or monuments here in the Boston area. Myself, JD, and another person in our ethnic studies community, Jeremy Aponte, worked this past summer on a unit that really was exposing Boston, famous rich Bostonians who profited off of slavery. You know, the most well-known being Peter Faneuil, but others as well, you know, Codman, yeah, all over. So I have found as a history teacher that that's a way to really get students to buy in to why this matters. Like this person is being honored, right? This person, you use this person's name when you talk to your friends, right? That like that matters. And so I appreciate like bringing that to this important issue. And I mention it because I think it's, you know, you always have to be careful in not making false equivalencies, and you have to be careful to talk about the unique experiences of each group. But I do think that I want to do a better job of highlighting what JD said, the solidarity, and also the similar experiences of colonization and systemic racism faced by Black and Asian communities, because you do see that division at Charlestown High and across Boston between those communities. And in addition to public symbols, the other thing I'm thinking about is, you know, artifacts. What a powerful scene in Black Panther when Killmonger, you know, liberates some African artifacts. And I think there's some comparisons to be made of all the ancient Asian art, and I'm sure very meaningful artifacts that are in, you know, museums across the US and Europe. So that's what's on my mind. I'm nearing the end. Has Alda gone? Pass it to Alda. Or maybe Katie?
Yeah, feel free, Alda, to write in the chat if that's more comfortable for you as you're. I think in other spaces you're from Brookline, is that right? I remember you were saying that you're from Brookline High, I think. I'm not sure. But I guess me, yeah, there's just a lot thinking in my mind. And like, I think that I especially was thinking about what JD and Layla were saying, and thinking about just this. I think for me as an Asian American, thinking about like how much I've been conditioned to not know and to not speak about it. And the American dream is placed on us to silence us, this indebtedness to this country, right? That we have a debt that we owe to this country because they took us in and whatnot, right? Like there's all this, and that coming to understand that's been a huge socialization. It's been internalized, right? For me, and how much it will be a whole lifetime of unpacking that consistently, constantly, because it's being inundated all the time. Yeah, I'm just thinking about those things. And JD, the comment you made about just like I think what you made a comment of something like not blaming ourselves, right? And that I think that's why sort of we ended on this idea of like, to try to make things visible is the only way to see things that we didn't see before, right? Because we're told that it's just the normal way this is normal, right? This is how it's always been, right? And when we see it in another way, when we unpack that, when we unveil that, it feels like the only way toward a sort of freedom of self, right? A liberation of self. It was really nice having all of you in the space. I think everyone went, is that right? And we're 3 minutes ahead of schedule, which never happens for ethnic studies when we're in spaces together. But thanks, Molly, for doing tech. Thanks, folks, for showing up. And again, this is actually already up on our website. So if you just Google Ethnic Studies Now, Boston Teachers Union, Ethnic Studies Now Committee, you'll find it on our website. And we'll also send it out to different crowds of, so it's not only the Google slides that are available for you and all the notes. So like a lot of stuff we're talking from are actually in the notes, the speaker notes. Feel free to use those, download those, modify them to your classroom, to what you need. As you can see, like it's a lot of slides. And so it's sort of the basis of a unit. And if you wanted to build in more, we actually have like a 20-something page document of resources that we also built. So that one has like primary source, secondary source documents. I wrote and rewrote something for 9th grade and for 6th grade that's like around 700 words long, because we know that that's what teachers do in the summer. They rewrite texts because they can't find them. And there are like 5-minute videos to show about this, and there are 10-minute videos to show. So there's in their field trip suggestions. So, Cecil, I will go with you to the Puberty Ethics Museum in Salem. There's lots of things to be liberated from there. Like, it's amazing how much stuff they have. They actually have a really good exhibit that examines that history of opium and its connection to those artifacts. And a few of us were in this room actually were a part of just helping them like be more critical about what they own, right? So anyway, we will share all those things with y'all, and I will maybe just right now just drop the Ethnic Studies Now website on it so that you can see it. It's all on it right now. Just poke around on that. All right. Thanks, folks. Take care.